Hello again, everyone. Tom Simmons coming to you with another installment of Economics with Tully. And I'm going to step aside from the camera just for a second. I want you to take a look at the palace that's behind me. Now, I can tell you, I will travel far to make these videos. But I don't go to Europe. This is not Versailles. I am at the Capitol Plaza in Albany, New York, and the building behind me that is serving as the backdrop for this video is where the New York State Assembly meets, and they're the lower house of New York State government. This particular video that I'm producing today is on the subject of government failure. So I figured a government office building might be an appropriate place in order to take this video. More importantly, though, we're looking at government failure from the perspective of the influence of government spending and government involvement in the economy. In my last video, I talked a little bit about New Hampshire and how the culture was such that government is not looked upon by the citizens as an engine to make many changes or to be very heavily involved. New York State probably has the opposite culture. The current budget, the 2015 budget of New York State, is $92 billion. That's just what the state government is spending. That doesn't include New York City or the Port Authority or the counties or the school districts. That's just New York State's budget. And that budget is actually bigger than the entire GDP of 140 different nations around the world. It's said that one of the most popular sports in New York is politics. And there's a culture here that says when you want something done, you go to government. You call City Hall. You call your state legislator. You call the town. You call the county. And so, as a result, you have a government that is much larger than in many other states. And of course, you've got a very large population here as well. And you have an awful lot of people walking around saying, "Who is this guy? And what kind of a video is he taking?" In my earlier video on this topic, we talked about the historical precedents, the historical threads that went into classical economics. What I'm going to look at today are modern theories of government failure. Why is it that so often people complain about the actions their governments have taken when they've entered into the economic realm? And what is it about a government acting as an economic player that makes it different from the private sector? And so we're going to look at 5 or 6 different reasons for government failure and why classical economists are very reluctant to suggest a role for government in the economy. The first one of these theories is called capture theory. And capture theory basically says this: a regulated interest will always capture the government agency that is designed to regulate it, and then will use that agency for its own benefit. So let me give you an example of capture theory. For many, many years, the United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, has prohibited the importation of Canadian drugs into the United States. And the reason that the FDA gives for this is the safety of American citizens. They want to make sure that the drugs that are taken here and are sold here are safe for Americans to take. And yet the reality is Canadians are taking those pharmaceuticals and they're not dropping all over the streets of Toronto or Montreal. They're perfectly safe. So why is it that Canadian drugs are not permitted to be sold in the United States? Well, a classical economist would say this has to do with capture theory. Now keep in mind that you, as a regular citizen, probably think that it's very important for the drugs you take to be safe. You want to know that when you take an aspirin, You're not going to, die from the cure for your headache. But at the same time, you don't know who the head of the FDA is. You don't know their address. You don't know their phone number. You don't know what's on their agenda. And there's a good reason for that, and it's an economic theory called rational apathy. It actually makes sense that you don't know that, because you as a citizen cannot possibly spend all your time knowing all of the items that are on all of the agendas of all the government agencies around the country. The cost to you would be greater than the benefit. So from an economic perspective, you generally don't know these things. On the other hand, do you think the pharmaceutical companies have a reason to know what's on the agenda and who's making the decision, and their name and their phone number, what they like to eat for dinner and what they drink? You better believe it. They have a vested interest, because knowing who's making that decision could result in billions of dollars of profits for them. So while you think the Food and Drug Administration's work is important, but know very little about it, because the cost exceeds the benefit for you, pharmaceutical companies know exactly what's on their agenda, and they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lobbyists because the benefit exceeds the cost for them. It's a basic economic equation. And so to a classical economist, they would say that capture theory is in effect here, meaning that American pharmaceutical companies have captured the ear, or actually captured the agency that is making this decision. And that the real reason the FDA does not permit Canadian drugs to come into the country has nothing to do with American safety. It has to do with safeguarding the profits of the American pharmaceutical industry. And you can see this in many, many different places. In Washington right now, there are a number of former executives from the Monsanto Corporation, a large agrochemical company, that are now installed in government offices in charge of regulating food safety and food labeling. That would be an example of capture theory. Another theory of government failure is that of public choice. And public choice theory is a very, very large topic. It's worthy of a course in and of itself. So I just want to expose you to the basic principle of it. Public choice theory, and the word public here does not mean you and me. It means government. Government is the public sector. We are the private sector. Looks at the way in which government makes decisions. And the economic incentives that exist for government agencies are different than the economic incentives that exist in the private sector. And I want to make this very clear. This classical approach that criticizes government does not criticize government because they feel government is inherently evil or the people working for it are bad, but because of the difference in economic incentives and disincentives in the decision-making process. For a private company, they have an incentive to lower the cost of whatever it is they're doing. Because when a private company lowers the cost of delivering a service, they increase their profit, and that is their incentive. Government, on the other hand, does not have this incentive. In fact, their incentive is the opposite. They don't have to worry about customers paying a high price because you have to pay your taxes no matter what. And they don't have to worry about making a profit because if a government agency spends much less than the budget they've been given, that's a disincentive to them. They actually have to turn that money back at the end of the year, and they'll probably get a lower budget in the following year. In fact, their incentive is the exact opposite. Their incentive is to ask for a large budget and then spend all of it, so that the following year they can say, hey, we need an increase in our budget. The normal profit incentive, the normal price mechanism that works in the private sector does not apply in the government sector. I myself once worked for a government unit, and at the end of the year, I had about $30,000 left in my budget. And I was told very directly, you better spend that or you're going to lose it. And by losing it, that meant turning it back to the source, and it also meant I'd have a lower budget next year. So what did I do? Of course I spent it. And I spent it on things I really didn't need, because the only way to get the same or a higher budget the next year was to spend all that money. The economic incentives and disincentives for government are very different than in the private sector. And so one reason for government failure is that it almost always costs the government more to do something that the private sector could do a lot cheaper. And that's the reason. It lacks that profit incentive. A third problem, and this is one that actually it might be the greatest of all, is the problem of unintended consequences. Very often when government decides to spend money on a particular project or to buy some goods or a particular service, they are looking at a particular problem and a way to address that problem. They don't take into account the ramifications and how people may react to news of that particular expenditure or endeavor. There are always unintended consequences. If a state government chooses to increase welfare benefits because they've determined that the assistance they're giving to their residents is not enough to help them get by on, so they raise the benefits. One unintended consequence, as you can imagine, might be that residents of other states may move in seeking higher benefits. Or residents from other states may not even bother to move in, but may claim a false address. We see this all the time when a state gives cut-rate tuition to its own residents. Residents from surrounding states do what they can to establish an in-state residency for the purpose of getting a lower tuition. This was not the purpose of the original cut-rate tuition. The purpose was to help in-state residents. But it has unintended consequences. And when government is only looking at a way to fix a particular problem, it rarely looks at the spillover, the ramifications. And for that reason, very often the unintended consequences result in government failure or even bigger problems than the ones they sought to actually address. Related to that, a fourth reason for government failure is something called rational expectations. We all know as students of economics that we act in our rational self-interest. We make decisions based on what's best for us at the time, given the information we have. But we also act based on what we expect to happen. So, I'll give you a few examples of rational expectations. Let's say that inflation is beginning to take off, and the government is concerned that people are buying too much and that they're going to accelerate inflation. One action the Federal Reserve may take is to raise interest rates or to raise the discount rate to discourage borrowing, to keep people from borrowing money and putting on the extra deck and putting in the extra pool and buying the extra car. Of course, the problem with that is notice of the action they're about to take gets out to the public long before they actually take the action. So if you're a member of the public and you're thinking, I may be interested in putting on a deck on the house, or buying a vacation home, or doing some extra spending in the next year or so, and you hear that the Federal Reserve may raise interest rates on the money that you're going to borrow a year from now, what might you be encouraged to do? Well, there's a good chance you're going to run out and borrow that money now and make that expenditure now. Well, the whole purpose of the Federal Reserve action was to stop rapid spending to prevent inflation. And yet, you will do an end run around government. Anticipating a raise in interest rates, you will run out and do that borrowing and do that spending now. accelerating the very thing the government is hoping to stop. In my own experience, I used to own a sheep farm, and the Department of Agriculture came out with a program to help sheep farmers. So what they said was, we will pay you $3 a head for all your sheep to reimburse you for the cost of having a professional shearer come around and shear your sheep. Well, everyone who shears sheeps, tongue twister, everyone who shears sheep heard about that. And so what did they do? They raised their price $3. It didn't help the farmers at all. If anything, it put more money in the pockets of someone who was not the intended beneficiary of the government action. And that's because, as economic beings, we act according to our rational self-interest and our rational expectations of what government's going to do in the future. A fifth cause of government failure is the fact that the opportunity cost for government action is so much greater than the opportunity cost for private action. Example: if I saw a poor individual sitting next to me and decided that I wanted to give them $10, the cost to me would be $10. The benefit to them would be $10. We're simply transferring $10 of wealth from me to that person. However, when government gets involved and says that it has to be the one to be involved in transfer payments, if they take $10 in taxes from me, that poor person's not going to get $10 of benefits, because the government needs to extract a certain amount of that to pay for the program. So the cost might be $10 to me, but the benefit to the poor person may only be $8. The cost actually exceeds the benefit of that transaction. Now, we can actually go even further and look at some of the sociological effects of this kind of transaction. When I personally give to someone who's poor, I'm doing it because I have voluntarily chosen to do that. I feel good about that. I have made the determination that this is something I want to do. Chances are the person on the receiving end actually feels some degree of gratitude. When that transaction doesn't exist, but government is entered into the picture, government is now taking that money forcibly from me. Rather than feeling good about that transaction, I am more likely to feel annoyed at that transaction and more likely to lobby my legislators to put an end to that kind of transaction. Furthermore, the person on the receiving end, rather than being grateful to a person with whom they have interacted, they are more likely to begin to feel entitled. I get my government check, I expect my government check, it's not here today, where is it? So that government provision for the poor has a greater opportunity cost and creates greater conflict in the society than when I choose to do it myself. Finally, probably one of the most important areas where government can fail when they enter the economy is through distorted incentives. It does not make economic sense, or it does not make environmental sense for people to build their houses in flood zones or on beaches where storms are likely to knock their houses down. And because it doesn't make environmental or economic sense, private flood insurance companies will not, on their own, provide flood insurance for people who choose to build in places where they shouldn't build in the first place. In that case, the market and sound environmental practices actually work together. They're on the same side of the fence. It doesn't make sense to build on a beach where a hurricane may knock your house down, and insurers are going to say, we're not going to give you housing insurance because it doesn't make sense. And yet, throughout this country, government, the federal government, through a flood insurance program, has provided tax dollars as a subsidy to insurance companies to insure these people anyway. That is a distorted incentive. That is government saying, well, we want to help these poor people out because they can't get insurance on their own. It enriches insurance companies, and it encourages people to build houses exactly where they shouldn't. Many people would say this is exactly what happened wrong with the government bailout of the banks during the 2008 financial crisis. These banks gambled with monies in ways that they shouldn't have. If they had won, they would have had a lot of money in their pockets. If they lost under a market system, they would have lost their shirts. But instead, government stepped in and provided the support. The incentive government has now created is that if you gamble with money and win, good for you. If you gamble with other people's money and lose, don't worry about it, because we will step in and help you. So for all of those reasons, the way government makes choices, the fact that they're subject to budgets and not making a profit, and the fact that they're not subject to consumers choosing to pay for their product, but are forced to through taxes, is an entirely different economic set of incentives and disincentives. The fact that you don't have the time to keep your eye on government all the time, but large corporations and vested interests do, mean that they will capture the agencies that are supposed to be regulating them. It means there are going to be unintended consequences for these government actions that they're not thinking about, because the economy is not something you can plan, but a series of millions or billions of individual actions and responses to what they see taking place out in the market. The fact that government opportunity cost has to be more than private action, because they've got to pay for these programs, which is why you've got a state like New York with a $92 billion government budget, not including local school taxes, cities, or the Metropolitan the Triborough Bridge Authority, the Metropolitan Port Authority of New York, or any of those things. It's for these reasons that very often those who subscribe to a classical economic approach say government should not be your first answer to everything. In fact, it should be the last answer. It should be the answer, it should be the mechanism that you use when all other market mechanisms have failed. And when there's a downturn in the market because of inflation or unemployment or lack of production, the first thing you should not do is run to government and ask for a fix, because what you end up doing is making things worse than they were. Instead, get the market out. Get the government out of the market, and let the market function. To a classical economist, government is best when it serves as the umpire in the game. Not as an owner of one of the teams, not as a coach to coach one of the players, not as one of the players itself, but as the umpire who stands back and watches the market do its thing, but then calls fouls when someone does something that is fraudulent or illegal or in some other ways wrong. The classical economist sees government functioning best as the umpire to the game and not as a player, and sees government as entering the game only as a last resort, not the first, because of all of these modern theories, modern reasons of government failure. Just to wrap up, it's not because government is bad. It's not because the people in government are bad. But it's because of the difference in incentives and disincentives that exist in a government function than in the private marketplace.